Hello, everybody. Distinguished colleagues, financial experts, policymakers, donors, civil society leaders, women organizations, and fellow champions of gender equality and disaster risk reduction. I stand today to present Key Objective 6 of the Sendai Gender Action Plan, increasing and improving access to financing for disaster risk reduction initiatives that advance gender equality. This objective addresses a critical barrier that prevents women and gender inclusive organizations from leading transformating DRR work. Women's organizations and gender inclusion stakeholders often lack direct access to DRR financing mechanisms. Instead, they must rely on intermediaries, which reduces their control over resources and limits their ability to implement community specific solutions. The Sendai GAP identifies 9 key objectives with 33 recommended actions promoting gender equality. Key Objective 6 specifically calls for a significant increase in funding for DRR actions that achieve gender equality objectives, ensuring these are directly accessible to women's organizations. When women organizations receive funding directly, they can design programs based on their intimate knowledge of community vulnerabilities, implement culturally appropriate interventions that address women's specific needs, build organizational capacity and sustainability, exercise leadership and decision making authority, innovate with flexible, responsive approaches. Indirect funding through intermediaries often means women's organizations receive reduced resources, face bureaucratic delays, and lack input into program design. This undermines the effectiveness of gender responsive DRR. We should increase the total volume of funding for DRR initiatives that advance gender equality. Current funding levels are insufficient to meet the scale of gendered disaster risks in many countries. Secondly, improving accessibility by creating funding mechanisms that women's organizations can actually access. This includes reducing bureaucratic barriers, providing technical support, and for proposal development and accepting alternative accountability mechanisms. Third, ensuring appropriateness for funding by providing flexible multi-year grants that match the reality of community-based DRR work rather than short-term rigid project funding. India provides compelling examples of improved financing access. The National Disaster Management Authority established a dedicated gender responsive DRR fund with rupees 750 million. This fund provides direct grants to women's organizations for community based disaster preparedness initiatives. Over 120 women's organizations have received funding without requiring male intermediaries, enabling them to implement local resilience programs. In Kerala, the Kudumbasri mission demonstrates women led financing for DRR. Following the 2018 flood, the state established a rupees 300 billion women's disaster resilience fund accessible directly to Kudumbasri women's self-help groups. Over 45,000 women's groups received microgrants averaging rupees 15,000 each for disaster preparedness activities, including community early warning systems, evacuation planning, and relief management. Odisha's cyclone preparedness program shows women employment through dedicated funding. The state invested rupees 1.8 billion specifically in training and employing women as cyclone preparedness coordinators. Over 8,000 women received direct salaries and allowances for early warning, dissemination, evacuation, coordination, and shelter management. Bangladesh offers a powerful model of direct women's access to DRR financing. The Bangladesh Disaster Risk Reduction Fund allocates 45% of its resources to women led community initiatives. The fund provides direct grants to women's organizations without requiring male intermediaries or government oversight. Over 350 women's groups received funding for cyclone preparedness, flood resilience, and drought adaptation. The Philippines has established a dedicated gender and DRR fund. The Gender and Disaster Risk Reduction Fund with PHP 2.5 billion provides direct funding to women's organizations for DRR initiatives. Over 280 women-led MSMEs received disaster resilience business development grants. The fund accepts simplified application processes and provides technical support for proposal development, enabling grassroots women's organizations to access resources they previously could not reach. Nepal's Green Climate Fund demonstrated gender targeted DRR financing. The fund allocated 38% of its DRR resources to women led natural resources management projects. Women's farmer cooperatives received direct financing for climate resilient agriculture and disaster prevention. Over 15,000 women farmers accessed financing for drought resilient crops, flood barriers, and water conservation systems. The fund provides multi year grants matching the long term nature of climate adaptation works. The Pacific Islands have created women focused DRR financing. Fiji's National Disaster Management Office established a women led MSME development fund with 15 million for disaster resilient small businesses. Over 5,000 women business participants received direct funding for business continuity planning, infrastructure strengthening, and emergency preparedness. Women participation in decentralization programs implementing local resilience measures with direct funding access. Despite progress, significant barriers persist because complex application processes exclude grassroots organizations. Requirements for formal organizational registration disqualify informal women's groups. Short funding cycles don't match community based DRR timelines. Lack of technical support for proposal development, gender analysis requirements perceived as burdensome, and insufficient funding volumes relative to gender disaster risks. To achieve key objective 6, we should establish dedicated gender responsive DRR funds with direct access for women's organizations. Simplify application processes with simplified documentation and alternative accountability mechanisms. We should provide technical support for proposal development and project implementation and increase total funding volumes significantly for gender equality DRR initiatives. We can create accountability mechanisms tracking women's organizations' direct access to financing. Key Objective 6 recognizes that funding women's organizations is transformational. The Sendai GAP aims to accelerate progress towards mutually reinforcing goals of gender equality and disaster risk reduction. When women's organizations have direct access to DRR financing, they can implement more effective, culturally appropriate, and sustainable interventions. Thank you.